start. Thank you very much. My name's Philip Storey. I'm a forensic pathologist and I work for Queensland Health under the Division of Forensic and Scientific Services, and I'm currently the chair of the QHFSS Human Ethics Committee. Now, QHFSS, Queensland Health Forensic and Scientific Services, has its own campus out at Coopers Plains in Brisbane, and there are a range of laboratories that undertake a number of areas of scientific testing. I've divided those into two broad areas, those of public health interest and those involving forensic pathology. Now, my direct involvement is with forensic pathology, performing coronial autopsies and generating reports, primarily coming up with opinions as to cause of death in matters related to coronial autopsies. I'm going to start with a disclaimer. I need to mention that my discussion will involve in a general way some discussion about deceased people, research involving the deceased, and also the coronial system. I'm not providing any images of deceased, and no specific individual cases will be named or discussed. However, I am aware that there may be a range of reactions and some people may find the nature of this discussion broadly distressing. And I want to declare no conflicts of interest of which I'm aware. And I will be discussing some points of law, but I am a medical practitioner by training. I'm not a lawyer. And if anyone wants any more refined opinion than what I can give in this talk, I would urge them to contact a trained and appropriately qualified lawyer. Before I start the body of my talk, I just want to present a couple of research scenarios. The first one involves a submission to obtain a series of blood samples that have been stored on our shelves of varying post-mortem interval. That's the time between death and the time that the samples have been obtained from the deceased, and of varying shelf storage times. That's the time following which the samples have been obtained from the deceased and then stored in our shelves. And we're required to hold our samples for a very long period of time, up to 2 years. So they can be sitting there for quite a while. And the researchers want to look at a small molecule, gamma hydroxybutyrate. It's known colloquially as one of the date rape drugs on street level, fantasy or liquid ecstasy, or for the dyslexic, grievous bodily harm. It acts on brain receptors and it has effects similar to alcohol. And the application here includes a request for waiver of consent. I'll come back to these scenarios at the end of my talk after I've given the body of the delivery. The second scenario, it's projected that by needle puncture, an acidified slurry of drugs is introduced into the main windpipe of human cadavers. And it's assured that these people did not have deaths related to drug toxicology. The bodies are left at 48 hours at room temperature and blood is obtained from 10 different sites on the body. As I said, I'll come back and discuss these further right at the end. I just want you to have a little think about these as I go through the talk. The final one is the most confronting, and I apologise in advance. Researchers are seeking to obtain human cadaver infants, and the proposal is to passively drop them from a vertical height of 84 centimetres onto 3 sorts of surfaces. And the proposal involves a freefall acceleration and purposefully directed so that the head of these cadaver infants will impact the floor directly. And that will then be followed by CT scans and anatomical dissection of these infants. I should point out, in the wake of those, QHFSS is committed to principles of research as guided by the NHMRC, and all human research must abide by these principles of research ethics as particularly embodied in the national statement. Now, in the coronial setting, we have some constraints imposed upon us by certain legislation, chiefly the Queensland Coroners Act 2003. Now, every state has its own Coroners Act, and there's a lot of overlap, but they're not exactly the same. I only have direct familiarity with the Queensland Coroners Act, and that's the only one I can speak of within my own compass of work. There is some intersection with the Queensland Transplantation and Anatomy Act 1979 and the Births, Deaths and Marriages Registration Act. Now, under the Coroner's Act, the sorts of deaths that get reported to the coroner and then thereby come to us are what are called reportable deaths, listed here in legal speak, but I've divided them into a more vernacular kind of grouping to enable understanding. These are more what are called manners of death. Coroners, at the end of their investigation, come up with opinions as to manner of death, but all homicidal deaths, all suicidal deaths, all accidental deaths, then a group I'll call unascertained natural, and another little group where there's no cause of death certificate issued for one reason or another, as defined under the Coroner's Act. Now, the thing to note here, that the circumstances are always distressing for the next of kin. Never say always, never say never, but I'm going to say almost always sudden, unexpected, unpredictable, often in traumatic circumstances. They involve the police coming in and asking questions, unsettling people, making them feel guilty for one reason or another. They've had a loved one removed to an unfamiliar location, and they have no or very limited control over what happens during that coronial process. I'll just broaden the scope for potential for research in the setting of death. Three broad circumstances. I'm only dealing with one in this talk, donation to science. As a vernacular expression, that has no intersection with our service. Consent is generally pre-arranged and generally comes under the Transplantation and Anatomy Act of 1979. Hospital autopsies, again, generally come under the Transplantation and Anatomy Act. They are virtually non-existent at this point in time. They've been diminishing for the last several decades to come to the point where I'm not sure what the exact rate is at the moment, but really quite small. And again, there is no intersection with our service. So really my talk is focusing in on the reportable deaths that come to us under the Coroner's Act. Now, Section 11.2 of the Coroner's Act, and I'm really showing this slide because it's phrased as a must. There is an imperative. A coroner must and may only investigate a death if the coroner considers the death is a reportable death, or if the death was reported under Section 7. And then in Section 26.1, it states that the coroner starts having control of the deceased person's body when the coroner starts investigating the death. And that's when the coroner receives formal notification of the death from the police. And then that active phase of the investigation stops under a number of circumstances. And I just want to highlight Section F, where the coroner decides that it is not necessary for the coroner's investigation to keep the body after an autopsy, and the coroner orders the release of the body for burial. And then in the next section, the coroner must order the release of the body for burial as soon as reasonably practicable after the autopsy. So there is an imperative there for transit of the body through the system from time of reporting to the time that the active phase of the investigation has ceased, in order to transfer the body back to the next of kin, to the funeral home, to be back under the control of the next of kin. I don't want to dwell on this slide because it's quite confusing, but the sorts of tissues that we are permitted to take from the body during the course of a coronial investigation, dividing generally into prescribed tissue, which is, for want of a better term, larger portions, recognisable portions of the deceased, and they must be necessary for the investigation of the death, and a family member must be advised, and the family member must be given the capability of stating what is going to happen to the prescribed tissue. Now, over against prescribed tissue, there's non-prescribed tissue, which is mandated under the Coroner's Act as being tissue taken from the body that the doctor considers necessary to investigate the death and for testing only. So it's not covered by research purposes. Subsection 4, for a test, the doctor may remove tissue from the deceased person's body. We are permitted to take blood and urine samples in all cases under orders for all types of examination, but we're not permitted to take any other samples except for the purpose of testing, and all samples must be taken for the purpose of testing. There is one other type of tissue that is permitted to be removed, and that's called specimen tissue. It's quite confusing, and this comes under the Transplantation and Anatomy Act and relates to tissue that's converted into paraffin-embedded blocks and converted into microscopic slides. So during the course of a coroner's investigation, there is transit of the deceased's body that involves keeping only materials necessary for the death investigation, not for research purposes. So when the body is returned to the family, all prescribed tissue, the body itself, other things designated by next of kin are removed from us. What remains with us is specimen tissue, slides and blocks, a range of other biospecimens which have been removed for a purpose only consistent with the coroner's investigation of the death, and a number of data sets, for example, the digital data associated with CT scans. So I just want to pause and make an observation that's not immediately obvious, but I think is really important and quite basic to our considerations here. In relation to consent within the coronial sector, there are two separate processes. The deceased enters the coronial process via a mechanism that fundamentally lacks any consent. Reportable deaths are mandated by law, and essentially there is no consent. And then sometime later, a research team approaches with an idea for a research project which was not in view at the time that the materials of interest for that research project came into existence. And the participant is unable to consent, and it becomes impracticable to obtain consent through usual means. So therefore, coronial biospecimens and data have come to be available for research through a two-step process that involves firstly no consent, and secondly an inability to obtain voluntary informed consent. So there is a range of literature dealing with considerations of harm that might be directed to the deceased. And we've certainly encountered this attitude that stored biospecimens and data have been viewed as a repository of information to be mined, and a waiver of consent being a mere formality for the processes of the research. And I think this comes from a background of a spectrum of beliefs and attitudes to death. If people have largely materialistic assumptions on one end, non-materialistic assumptions on the other, religious attitudes to death, scientific attitudes to death, trying to fit the deceased into theoretical, philosophical frameworks, it does need to be asked in what ways the dead can be harmed. And there is some literature on this, although the applicability for a human ethics committee is quite difficult, and the scope and the principles are really hard to define, I think. We've come down to a concept of moral communities, next of kin. We really don't know what the reactions of next of kin are going to be to the prospect of research. What we do know is that it won't be uniform, and it can't be predicted, and it's going to be quite variable. So we don't really know, when it comes down to any individual specific instance, what the next of kin's attitude is going to be. And coming out of the coronial context, the next of kin has already been traumatized and harmed through their loss of autonomy, and also the process by which their next of kin has entered the coronial process. Is it reasonable to come back 6 months later and compound those harms? And we also believe that treatment should accord with maintaining the dignity of the deceased's ongoing legacy. Am I running out of time here?
No, you're going fine.
Thank you. So for the background, further background problems in relation to the forensic sector, particularly in the early 2000s, there have been a number of controversies related to the application and the concepts of what was appropriate research in relation to the deceased. A glaring example, unfortunately, of this was at the Glebe Forensic Mortuary in the early 2000s. That's culminated in a quite detailed report, the Walker report, which was quite scathing, of a number of practices that occurred at that mortuary. A number of Coroner's Acts have been revised in response to that, and that's a good thing. But it's certainly something that we have to keep in the back of our mind and keep in proper focus of next of kin's attitudes to the way that their loved ones have been handled in going through the forensic process. Brain retention was a very, very problematic one. So this requires us to carry a responsible stewardship of coronial materials, but unfortunately, this can also be translated to researchers considering us to be obstructive in our views. We have done a lot of thought, well, put a lot of thought as a HREC into trying to fit the deceased into the national statement. The concept of deceased as participants, active participants, is difficult. Trying to translate them to other groups that the national statement observes as being incapable of providing consent is actually difficult to, they're not coextensive, and I don't think the issues are the same. So we've been asking ourselves in what sense the deceased are active participants in research. Human biospecimens are quite well covered in the national statement, but I wouldn't consider that the body of the deceased as a whole should be considered in line with the national statement's understanding of a biospecimen. But I think it certainly does relate to the samples of tissue that have been obtained and removed from the body and have been kept in storage. Direct from the national statement, the use of stored human biospecimens for research, where it's contemplated that proposed research will involve the use of human biospecimens that have been obtained without specific consent. Only an HREC is, they can be used only if an HREC is satisfied that conditions for the waiver of consent are met. And there's a couple of points to particularly consider: whether there is a pathway to identify and recontact the donors, which is not a possibility in our context; whether there is a known or likely reason for thinking that the donors would not have consented, which is highly impracticable in our setting. So the conditions for waiver of consent, all well known. I'm not going to dwell on this in any great detail, but I did want to just briefly touch on the concept of distributive justice, which I think has an applicability in our field. The concept that the benefits and risks of research be distributed across groups so that no group unfairly bears the burden of research. So this idea of research on the deceased simply being there because it's a convenient repository of stored samples, I don't think is a sufficient justification to go and mine that availability for data. So given the issues surrounding consent, we as an HREC insist on full consideration to be given to an alternative cohort for whom appropriate consent processes are defined and are practical. And oftentimes we find that an alternative study design applied into the living, or an animal model or a computer model may suffice as an alternative. Other considerations which I think need to be kept in view other than consent, but the other hallmarks within the ethical framework: respect, beneficence, the benefits of the research needs to be kept in clear focus, I think. Ultimately, though, in our setting, the deceased and the derived biospecimens are under the control of the coroner and the Coroner's Acts. So broadly, in addition to ethical considerations, we as an HREC have taken the view that the coronial process should not be interfered with, and that investigations performed on the deceased, their biospecimens and their data be in the interest of the coronial process. So I'll just come back to scenario 1, and I'll just explore those in the light of the discussion that I've just given. So gamma hydroxybutyrate, in addition to being a a drug, 5 minutes, thank you. In addition to being a drug of abuse, it's also naturally generated in the body. And it, the amount that's generated may vary with the post-mortem interval, and it may actually vary with the duration of storage in as a blood sample in our storage rack at our facility. So in order to try and determine, and this may actually have implications for a death investigation if at a later time someone brings up an allegation as to the deceased having been given against their will gamma hydroxybutyrate as a date rape drug. So this research, in my view, does have beneficence and it does benefit the coronial process. Is there another cohort on whom this research could be performed? No. The person has to be deceased. There has to be a variation in the post-mortem interval, and there has to be a variation in the length of time that the samples are stored in the shelving. And there is no other cohort on whom such an investigation could be performed. Touched on beneficence, yes, depending on study design, etc. But for the purposes of this talk, I think that there is beneficence in this project. Does it contribute to coronial process? Yes. Is it low risk? Again, depending on study design, I would say that a design could be incorporated such that this would be a low risk project. So depending on the full details, I think that this project is in line with the coronial principles that we've been discussing. I might skip over the second one in the interests of time because I really wanted to talk about the last one, the human cadaver experiment. Now, this was actually a real experiment conducted in Germany in 1984. I have no idea what the ethical background, if any approvals were given or any consultation. I would suggest that a study like this would have a hard time getting through in today's ethical climate. But nonetheless, this project did take place. But I just want you to consider a scenario: father of a young infant left alone with the infant. When the mother returns home, the infant is found to be poorly responsive, and the father states that the infant fell passively from the change table onto a carpeted surface. Infant is taken to the hospital. Infant is found to have a skull fracture. Now, is there another this particular study type, is there another cohort for whom a similar type of study could be run? No, there is no animal model. There is no computer-generated model that could adequately account for the variations and the structures. As we get more sophisticated, maybe, but at this point in time, still not sophisticated. I would suggest that there is no other cohort for a study such as this. That still doesn't make it ethically viable, but I'm just suggesting I don't think that there's another cohort for this sort of study. Does the project contribute to coronial process? Yes. Is the project low risk? I'm not too sure that I'd find anybody who would agree to calling this a low risk project. Does the project have beneficence? I would suggest yes. A project such as this may contribute to a legal argument to prevent a miscarriage of justice. And I think that in terms of legal ethics, that's got to carry some weight. So I'll just move quickly through. The latest edition of Knight's Forensic Pathology, which is a standard forensic pathology text. Webber's work on dead infants probably could not be repeated in the present ethical climate, and obviously no data can be derived from the living. He states that with a somewhat lamentable tone. And you know, something in me mildly agrees. I don't fully agree, but if I go now just to summarise, I've given some illustrations as to how we have attempted as an HREC to apply our role within a forensic setting, but being cognizant of the legal constraints that we face. If you've got questions after this, I can't guarantee I can give you answers because I'm raising issues largely and not settling them. I've provided some answers, some personal thoughts, but I don't think that anything is finally settled as yet. The national statement is a document guiding researchers and committee members to come to ethical decisions regarding any research dealing with humans. But I really wonder if there is sufficient guidance, given the considerations that I provided in this talk, to aid in fully directing research with the deceased. I think there is scope for further discussion on this. Section 4 did come under review last year. I did send a submission in raising some of these issues. We'll get some feedback in due course, no doubt. I would just close by, I'm aware of the legislative constraints. I am really wondering if overall beneficence of research may have a sufficient power to overcome these problems with consent, because these are serious problems in my view, these consent problems. Anyway, I'll finish there. I think I'm over time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.